Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hongkongggag podcast. So sorry for a very long break between episode two and episode three. It was mostly technical issues, but I've also thought about making this more just chatting with different people and recording it, so it doesn't, so we can it will be more relaxed next artwork. So why don't you introduce yourselves, guys? Wait, what happened? Like, he just left.
We just lost someone.
Oh no. Let's just keep recording. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name's Matthew. I'm a student at university in the United States. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just want to talk about mainly just various topics. The first thing I remember you were talking about would be kind of like localism in Hong Kong. I just want to ask you, what do you think of localism here in Hong Kong? Yeah.
Well, I think first off, I always want to say that, right, having not grown up in Hong Kong, I think there's always some degree that an outsider talking about it to some degree cannot fully understand it. But I think what I would say is a lot of the grievances are on grievances that the government needs to address. Economics, inequality in Hong Kong is really bad. The statistics, the Gini coefficient in Hong Kong is extremely high. So these are grievances that the lack of opportunity for people in Hong Kong in the 21st century is really an issue. So I'd say it's like the emphasis maybe on preserving culture, and it is the outsider's problem. And it perhaps it's not the outsider's fault. It's not more recent immigrants from mainland China to Hong Kong that are screwing Hong Kong's problem. It comes from the fact that there needs to be steps taken by the government to mitigate the income disparity, and the government has failed in that sense to do that. And so I think that's where a lot of the localism sentiment comes from, and also the failure of umbrella revolution to bring any reforms to the system, for some people to be more radical. The lack of progress towards the fulfillment of universal suffrage as specified in the basic law. So I think that's, I would say, I think their sentiments are true, but I think a lot of the solutions where we're pointing it to outsiders, or we're pointing to culture, or it diverges from what actually the root of the problem. Like if we take parallel trading, right? People from mainland China that buy baby formula in Hong Kong, and right, it's not necessarily that it's the mainland parents that are buying baby formula's problem. It's more issues with quality of formula, and parents will do whatever it takes to protect their child. And so these parents are just trying to protect their children, and they want what's best for their children, like any other parent. And so it's not really them. It's really an issue with the quality of goods and things like that. And of course, parents they're willing to pay prices, and it drives up rent, and so there are side effects, and it drives out other businesses because it's lucrative. And so, the government really needs to be thinking about how can we deal with these rental issues with parallel trading, and it's really not the outsider's fault. It's people are desperate for their own well-being. And I think that, of course, that the mainland government, in the case of parallel trading, has to, of course, increase the quality of its goods, so that way parents can feel confident in the products they are getting.
Yeah, so there's an issue of how well Hong Kong is kind of like demonizing like mainlanders, and just how they kind of don't see an issue, how they don't see them as kind of like, yes, I get that there is a problem with mainland tourists in Hong Kong, and the parallel trading doesn't really have a good effect on the local population, but the solution is not to create anonymity, especially in a time like this, and just hate and spread discrimination. And when in reality, Hong Kongers are kind of I wouldn't say that we are exactly Chinese, of course, but like we are quite similar. Like we have a
Mm-hmm.
similar culture, and Cantonese is like it or hate it, like it's a dialect of Chinese, and there's already much changing. Like Hong Kong future is definitely like good or bad. It will be tied into China, and a lot of people don't seem to know that anymore, which is disappointing. And another thing I've
Mm-hmm.
noticed is with localism that what it says apart from the pan democracy camp that it's more anti China, like China as a whole, rather than actually being pro democracy. Like it just feels like they're trying to aim at something that is not what the main yellow camp wants for the movement, and instead what they want is something much more radical and something that may not even look like the original plan. And I hope that this movement doesn't get consumed by more extreme opinions, or else it would not survive.
Yeah, I think well, if we look at like what like Martin Lee and a lot of the Democratic Party leaders and the Pan Democrats in the '90s, right, they were pushing for democracy not in just Hong Kong, but right, the hope was one day China would become democratic. The hope was always that in the eyes of the key Pan Democratic leaders, that it would right that China would one day be more like Hong Kong in terms of its openness and democratic institutions, and Hong Kong was developing just starting to develop in the 80s and 90s, and that was a sign of something for China that one day would have. Right, and like the whole Tiananmen Square Memorial, right? The big push of part of their movement is to not just recognize Tiananmen Square, but to push for democracy in China. The whole point is that right, we want to those people that fought for democracy in China, we want their legacy to continue. That what they strive to do one day will come to fruition. I think that right, if we focus just purely on Hong Kong, then we lose the picture of that. Right, that whole idea of like a democracy for China. It doesn't mean that if you're pushing for democracy in China, it doesn't mean that Hong Kong becomes it's just completely part of China in sense of it's still Hong Kong has a unique history from the 150 years of colonialism that won't be erased by that. And so I think that's a big switch in the pushes that are more of a local identity. It's about Hong Kong, and it's not about maybe a democratic movement in China. That Hong Kong can be a window for China to change, and that we can be kind of the catalyst of change in China, which I think was a lot of the hope of the Pan Democratic camp going into '97 was that Hong Kong would become the sign of something else. With its more openness and at least the beginning of its democratic underpinnings with LegCo in 95 being fully elected finally, and the district councils in the 94 were full no abolishment of appointment seats. Like these were meaningful steps that perhaps one day could be built on something more. Yeah, and I think that failure of that vision, I think, has driven people to a more radical vision. That the failure of that to come to fruition was right. The failure of the universal suffrage has driven people, and that people would see that as the failing of the pandemocratic camp, which to some degree, yes, they may have been a little too optimistic, but a lot of people were too optimistic in '97. And I would say on the whole anti-mainland mindset, I would say it's just yeah, just the government, the people are finding a scapegoat, and because they're different. At the end of the day, there's yes, Hong Kong is influenced by Chinese culture. We speak Cantonese, but we write in Chinese characters. Most Hong Kongers are not using English in their daily lives. We're not using English. We're using Cantonese, and so I think that there is some degree that like even if we're different than China, and like Chinese means something, Chinese can mean different things where you live. Right, there's Chinese immigrants all over the world in the diaspora. In Chinese, and immigrants in every country look differently, and they act differently, and they're different than what perhaps is in what we call China now. And so I think in the same sense, Hong Kong can always be like that. And it can, we can be ethnic Chinese, and we can embrace aspects of Chinese culture, but still be different. And we don't have to antagonize mainlanders who have no reason to like us now. We just spit on them.
Yeah, I believe that around 1997 there was this like gradually there were like democratic development in China. Like they experimented it with villages. I think in the early 20s was C came along. Like there was like some hope for like democracy in China. Like it wasn't just like something that's like, oh, it's not, we're gonna have to like overthrow the government. Like there were plans for actual democracy. Like it wasn't something that was a sense like China was not a haven of free speech before Xi Jinping came along. Let us remind ourselves, it was by far, it was still committing atrocities against human rights, and there was the issue with the Uyghurs in East Turkestan or Xinjiang. But it was nowhere as bad as it is now, and I think that's what made a lot of people much more despondent and like search for much more extreme solutions. Like a lot of people know that okay, this doesn't work. We need to aim higher. But like in some cases, just because that it may work in some cases doesn't mean that extreme action is the way to go. And it almost is. It almost never works. Like it rarely does. And when it does, it doesn't work in Asia. I'm just trying to say extreme action does not work. I mean, it kind of does, but like it can have bad consequences over here in Asia. I'm not trying to say that democracy does not work in Asia. But what I'm trying to say is that um, the road to democracy is much more tedious, and it's not something that it's not like post-Soviet collapse. It is something that is some. It's not something like the countries that collapsed after communism fell in like 1989. It's something that it requires a lot more work and
Yeah,
a lot more openness. Like I believe that Asia could become a mostly democratic continent. Like we can definitely see a lot of countries becoming proper democracy, but you can't just apply Western logic to Asia. It does not work.
yeah. I think what's also the geopolitical situation is different, right? Versus the Soviet Union and the 80s was on the downhill and things were starting to unravel. And so I think that right, so like countries like Poland with solidarity or the Velvet Revolution, Czechoslovakia, all these movements were in a time when the Soviet government just kind of put its hands up. We also got to remember, like even now, like Belarus is a dictatorship, right? And then a lot of the like Central Asian republic, former Soviet republics, still are not very democratic. And so I would say that it's democracy is hard, and I would say even in the West, like if you look at looking at the United States, it didn't happen overnight, and the United States is not perfect. It still has a lot. The Electoral College is anti-democratic, but it took a long time to expand suffrage, to expand elections, to even elect the Senate. It took into the 1900s, and so it was a gradual process of inclusion. And so I think like nothing happens overnight. Like the British, look at the UK. Suffrage did not happen for most men until the late 19th century under Gladstone, and and the like 1832 reform was like, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, was like just it doubled the electorate to like from like 1 to 3% or something like that, 1 point something to 3 point something. It was too long. I took that course too long ago. So it was just gradual, and so I mean, like even look at Taiwan, right? Right under Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT for a long time, they had martial law, and it wasn't until within the last few decades where Taiwan has developed more democratically. And so I think, yeah, democracy is fragile. And I think if anything, with what's going on in the world today, democracy, even in quote Western countries like the United States, is under threat.
Yeah, like Taiwan, like they had to go through very tedious process. Like arguably, it was it was very like didn't even get proper democracy until I believe the early 90s, and that's saying a lot. Like, and the same kind of happened in like South Korea with how they only got democracy in the 1980s, and there are a lot of countries that we consider democracies in Asia, but like are they really democracies? And the answer seems to be yes, but like barely. Like for example, take Singapore, which is basically an authoritarian state, but with enough democratic institutions to be considered democratic, if you get what I mean. It's like it's very
Yeah.
confusing.
Mhm.
Yeah. And just I think there's this fear that I have that like if Hong Kong gets like a proper democratic system with an equivalent parliament, an equivalent to the executive branch or the judicial branch, and the people are coming here to elect the president or like the head of state at least, and not head of state, like the guy who is
Head of government.
equivalent
Yeah.
to a president. Yeah, there's always this fear that parties will try to seek control and take control of the system. Like in Hong Kong, like even though on hindsight we have a lot of diverse political parties, in reality it's like we honestly have like just three political parties, just three big factions. Like wait, one is small, like that's localism. We have the pro Beijing pro establishment, and then we have the pro democracy and like localism, which is kind of like as we mentioned before, I think kind of in pro democracy, but not really at the same time, and that's really confusing. But it's just this fear that if we do get democracy, there is this fear that we could relapse into dictatorship or have a dominant party which takes control. Or potentially, as you mentioned, there's always this fear that, like in Malaysia, there could be a law that is more kind of like discriminating against other ethnic groups in Hong Kong. Like in Malaysia, Malays are considered superior, and I do
Mhm.
not want that to see that in Hong Kong because seeing that it's just going to be very disappointing and would be very kind of like contradicting to what the original view of democracy was in Hong Kong. Because I feel like Hong Kong is a city that has democratic institutions, like at least before 1997, but without the actual democracy, and that's one of the things that is always very confusing and laughable. And just why do we not have the right to choose our leaders? Like we don't even have the right to choose off Legico as I'm speaking right now. We
Yep.
still do not have the right to choose off Legico, and that's definitely something that's an oddity. Like in like other countries that we don't consider dictatorship, we consider kind of like more authoritarian or hybrid regimes. We see them not have like the same experience that we had. Like it was like colonialism last after World War II didn't last very long. Like India got no, not India.
Well, India did after World War II. It was like within a couple of years after World War II.
No, just it is kind of considered a democracy. So just pick
Yeah.
up on an example.
Like
Sorry,
Singapore would be kind of not really a democracy.
yeah. I was thinking like Vietnam with how Vietnam got democracy. Didn't really get no. I mean Vietnam did have a war,
Vietnam,
like they got
Vietnam was a
independence,
mess. Yeah.
and then you also have Myanmar, which has the same situation right now as
Yeah.
talking with the coup and the military state.
Yeah.
And of course, we can't forget about Indonesia with its dictator, I believe, was called Sukarno, who kind of rose to power during the Japanese era, and just have these people who are campaigning on the era of neocolonialism, but after that, they just don't have knowledge of nation state because of how rapid colonialism kind of decayed and how quickly the European powers pulled out, causing more friction between these new states. And whereas in Hong Kong, it took 50 years after the end of World War II for us to be given to China, which isn't a good thing, of course, and it's not us becoming independent, but that gave enough time for democracy to kind of flourish in Hong Kong, like democratic ideals and like more openness in Hong Kong. And one should not ignore what the last governor, Chris Patten, did in the last days of colonial Hong Kong with how he basically argued for more democracy, and he is still arguing right now, but he doesn't have
Yeah.
the same power as he did. And I feel like it's something that we need to address. That
Mhm.
democracy, what would it look like in Hong Kong? Like, what would a functioning democracy look like? How would it work? And how can we prevent it to becoming potentially another United States where you have a very polarized society, or worst case scenario, something that we see in Russia or Myanmar or Vietnam. Or maybe
Yeah.
not
I
Vietnam
think
because, like I said, it went through a war. So
Vietnam
forget
is
Vietnam.
tricky. Vietnam is tricky because like the southern government was always in a minority position, even amongst its own people. So I think that's really tricky. So I don't South Vietnam generally did not really have even the support of its own residents, which says something about South Vietnam and the U.S. involvement and stuff. That's a whole other story. But I think first is the institutions. Like if we look at Russia after the end of the Soviet, right? Didn't Russian's institutions were not very strong. It's it had right before the Soviet Union, it had a brief period of like the first legislative Duma, but then like the Tsar would like dismiss it because he didn't like the composition, and so it really was like not very democratic in the 1900s. So the legacy, I think, with it's about your institutions. Like we can even look at like first world country like Germany during the Weimar Republic. The governmental institutions in Germany were not very strong, and so there was a lot of problems with governance. It's not necessarily democracy is bad, but just governance in Germany in the 20s and 30s. Part of that is because of Versailles and the restriction of that, but part of it was just the German government did not know. He was not very good at what it was doing in the 20s, and so I think it's always to the institutions themselves. I think with the colonialism, you have an interesting aspect where, like, quote, European countries claim to like want to civilize and prepare these countries for self-rule. That was never the point of colonialism, and so these European countries just kind of like decided, okay, we shouldn't be colonizing anymore, and just kind of walked away without like realizing the damage they'd done. And so leaving people to fix it themselves. And so I think that's always been a problem. I think in Hong Kong, because it was longer, and so things were developed. Like Hong Kong became a first world state of some sort, city, territory, whatever you would like to call it, in terms of development, was first world by '97. But I would say that even Hong Kong's institutions are not that strong. Like even after like if we look at like the issue with protesting and police objection, that's comes from the British colonial era, the 19th, things that were used in the '67 riots. And so I'd say Hong Kong has better institutions left than a lot of other colonial institutions in '97, but democracy was something that came in the '80s. Really did not come in the '80s for the district council and UrbCo. And we can talk about how little power UrbCo and district councils actually have. And it wasn't until '91 we had direct elections for LegCo. And so I would say Hong Kong had the beginnings of democracy, maybe more so than a lot of other countries, but not British. And first of all, Hong Kong's not a country, but other colonial possessions. They rephrase that. Other colonial possessions. But I'd say still very young. I think the key is, we have multiple parties, different camps, and there will be polarization. But I think that what will happen is realities of governance. I think that if one party, the pro-Beijing party with the functional constituency, doesn't have to worry about governing, I think the pro-democracy camp, if it actually had the choice to govern, it would have it would be forced to compromise. I think it would be forced to stabilize. I think a lot of the arguments would disappear. I think because when you have to govern, then you typically behave better. When you're in the opposition, you can say things to try to get votes, but when you're actually governing, you have to be more practical. And so I think that will come. And I think as we talk about like protections for minorities, even the basic law has protections, and Hong Kong's a covenant to the ICCPR, which would promise protections, and it's also a covenant to the ICPS or something like that. And so these underpinnings of these basic rights that are supposed to be guaranteed by the government would still need to happen, and would be obligation of international law. And so I don't think it could unravel. Also because I don't know if localists could get a majority. Let me just say that. I think localists would need the traditional pan-democrats to be able to govern a majority. That's just because there's just not enough, enough middle age and older yellow camp people that would vote for localists. You're going to need the pan-democratic parties to govern, which will, even if the localists won the largest share of seats, it would push them to compromise, because they would be relying on that. Like Civic and Democratic Party are not going to be pushing very localist agendas. That's just not going to happen. And so I think that there's something about the radical element, just like even the pro-Beijing camp. If it had to win like geographical seats, more radical ones like Junius Ho and Regina Ip cannot drive the agenda. They're going to have to compromise because that's the nature of governance in a democratic institution. I even think even in the U.S., like I think to some degree Republicans are getting more extreme, but even sometimes they've had to compromise. Like they will say things, but when they have to implement things, they have to actually govern. And like there's been times Republicans say they want to cut this, cut that, especially under the Obama administration. But then when they came to the time to discuss the budget with Obama, they had to compromise and they got chewed out by their base. But they had to do that, right? And so I think governance forces some things. And I think with the international law and the basic rights covered, if those are protected, and if Hong Kong's judiciary, which has been operating to some degree for now, for a long time since '97, I think the courts are strong enough to put the guardrails. And I think that between guardrails from the courts, long answer, guardrails from the court and institutions that are already been built, and just the need to govern a majority in a system, you cannot do whatever you want. That would be my hope.
Yeah, I think it's clear, like you said, that we need that the more extreme parts at least reasonable to like communicate with, need and more moderate and less extreme. Need like make compromise. Like we can't just have some kind of passive resistance. Like just can't just rely on giant peaceful protests. Like as good as that sounds, we can't just use that alone. And we can't start a war with like China. Like first of all, that would mean that even if we have U.S. support, we have to consider that both countries have nuclear weaponry, and it just seems like a pressing to start World War III button. So I feel like that's something in the middle needs to be met, and something that can actually be beneficial and can achieve the end goal while also giving both parties something that they want. Of course, not everyone's going to be happy, but in politics, it's not about happiness, it's about the best solution. And may not always be happy. Of course, we always want the best solution to be a happy one, but sometimes we have to accept small wins as big wins, if you get what I mean. Another problem because in Hong sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, okay, thanks. I just feel like here's a problem because here in Hong Kong we have this very this growing this growing youth who have been exposed to very negative connotations of mainlanders in like it's always been this negative connotation, but I feel like it's really risen, especially with the pandemic. Like the pandemic has inspired very racist comments. Like I remember seeing a comment on like Reddit, seeing this guy who is advocating like a Trump style wall across the Hong Kong mainland China border. And my first thought is just why? Just like I don't get why people feel like, oh yeah, this is totally not going to strain relations and not negatively affect our movement. And that's the issue because we have a very despondent situation in Hong Kong, and as I mentioned before, people in very dire situations will inevitably seek more extreme options, such as in Germany after the Great Depression. Hitler came about partially because of the Great Depression, and there was also an economic setback in Italy, which led to Mussolini to rise. And also in Japan, before in the interwar years, there was a greater rise in nationalism and how, especially with the rivalry between the Kosehan and Tosehan, and we also see this in Iran with the rise of the Islamic Republic eventually, and that's one of the dangerous things dealing with something a system with democracy. And I'm not trying to say again, democracy is not bad. I believe it is the ideal system, but the problem is just how can we make sure that there are guide rails, like you said, to prevent people and just prevent such like extreme parties to rise to power, and that's the main issue here.
Yeah, I think again it's about the institutions, right? Like with Germany, we can point to the Weimar Republic's fundamental structure that, first of all, the President Hindenburg at the end ruled by emergency decree. The Reichstag did not function really at the end, and so he was constantly ruling by decree. And so even though there was a legislature and there was some sort of democracy, it was like not really democratic. Even before Hitler's rise, it was dysfunctional. And so imagine a government. The comparison would be like, what would happen? If the chief executive only ruled by decree and there was the legislative council never passed anything at all, not even formally. And that was what was happening. So there was already dysfunction that such a system was being used, and that was the only way to govern. And I also think when you talk about younger people that are more radical, I think it comes to education, right? And so the education system cannot shy away from controversial issues. I fundamentally believe that if you do not teach students about issues, then they will not understand them. Then they will come to their own conclusions. And then they come to really bad conclusions. But let's just be honest. Like when I was younger, I made stupid conclusions about things because we didn't talk about them in class. I whatever, like crazy ideas about like Obama's terrible and like he's like some Muslim crazy person, which is just not irrational, right? But then that's what you read online and you don't talk about it in class, and this is what you'll believe, you know. And so there's this fear, and the education system needs to talk about these issues. And so we need to talk about what are the problems that Hong Kong people face, but B, why, what are the solutions, and why scapegoating people isn't going to fix it. If we get rid of mainland people, will Hong Kong's inequality go away? No. Will working class people all of a sudden have a nice flat? No. The social safety net will still be small, right? It will still be Hong Kong's still one of the most expensive places to live in the world. Even under the British era, Hong Kong was increasingly expensive. So probably this is not the answer, and so the teachers need to be thinking about how to teach students. I think how to teach students about these issues, and like how can we make society better, and like critically thinking, and like all the shortcomings of liberal studies. Like kind of this interdisciplinary thinking about the issues of Hong Kong faces today, I think is really important. I think that is something that can be for sure improved, and I think to promote more diverse views and to make sure that the voices of ethnic minorities are included. But yeah, it comes down to what are students learning, and if students are not being taught how to think about these issues in a way that like understand the issues and provide actual solutions to the problem and the root of the issue, and it's not going to happen. The people are just going to scapegoat, and that's the United States, right? Trump is a perfect example, right? In a quote democratic country, we had a guy that's very authoritarian that that talked about quote building a wall and right kicking immigrants out, and then it's Muslims and it's it's illegal immigrants from Mexico, it's whatever, it's China virus, it's so Chinese are trying to take over, and all these things, right? And so it's scapegoating, right? Real grievance in the United States with income inequality, the lack of middle class jobs as we move to a service sector, and like not even having health care. But instead of providing health care, blaming the immigrants that you don't have health care is not going to give you health care. And so yeah, I think even like the United States, it shows a failing on its own system, its own education system to develop the ideas of people and to really think about these issues. And so I think that is a danger, and I think that's why education is so important. And it's really, the school should not shy away from controversial issues because students will come to their own conclusions if you don't guide them and help them. And so, it won't, not talking about it doesn't mean it doesn't go away. If we don't talk about COVID, it doesn't mean COVID doesn't exist. If COVID's still there. We can pretend COVID doesn't exist, but people will die. And so that's the same thing.
Yeah, I just feel like there is this issue with scapegoating in Hong Kong, and just everyone's pointing the blame at something that it is easy to blame. Like oh look, mainlanders are crowding areas and crowding residential areas with tourist buses. Oh, yeah, that's bad. Like, let's blame them. Like, obviously it is an issue. We shouldn't ignore it. Like, this isn't an excuse to say, oh yeah, no, mainlanders can come in and just do that. But the appropriate reaction and the appropriate solution is not to ramp up anti-mainland sentiment and create something that cause um mainlanders locusts. Like, I remember Apple Daily back in the day, they made something that was comparing mainlanders to locusts, and although Apple Daily is the biggest pro democracy newspaper here in Hong Kong, um, it has a lot of issues that we shouldn't ignore. Like, just because it's yellow doesn't mean we should save from criticism, and that goes for other extreme parts of the movement. Like, we shouldn't be reluctant to say, hey, maybe this isn't the way to go. Like, we are fighting for democracy, so why are we not allowing an open debate, an open discussion, an open forum, as you can say?
Mhm.
And that's one of the main issues with the pro-democracy camp here. People are so divided that it would take a lot to. I'm not saying it's impossible. Like, I wouldn't even say it's very unlikely, but I just feel like we have to find a solution so we can actually, have a fighting chance against the CCP. Whether that be
Yeah.
through a more active means or more passive means, I feel like that there. I know I don't have a very advanced solution in mind, but I believe that we can come up with something that is a compromise yet also works well enough for the downfall of the CCP. And a lot of people say Hong Kong's one is very unlucky, but I feel like Hong Kong is quite lucky. Like, we have these institutions for possible democracy, and we can use them. We can with what we can do, we can use them. Like, I don't think Hong Kong I don't think Hong Kong will be as easily falling into authoritarianism or a hybrid regime as other countries, and that is something that we should look forward to. Just want to thank Matthew for coming along today to the podcast. I know that it's been a while. There have, like I've been said at the beginning of the episode, a lot of technical issues, and this podcast, I actually thought that it would really go under. So I hope this makes it to YouTube. I hope you guys really take a listen to it, because coming this summer, we will be uploading more on the YouTube channel. Like, I can promise you, Hongkongggag will be changed. Like, it like, just what I'm trying to say is, get ready for summer. It's going to blow your